exception and a variance as permitted by the Unified Development Code, ordinance number 2000-T, to allow special exception for the city to issue a building permit for expansion of a pre-existing non-conforming use that is not in compliance with the future land use plan map and or zoning district when the zoning board of adjustment determines that this special exception will not adversely impact water, wastewater, drainage, and street transportation systems, and is in accordance with all city codes and applicable comprehensive plan policies, including those pertaining specifically to land use compatibility. And number two, variance to reduce the landscape buffer for a non-residential use that has a side or rear contiguous to any residential use or residential zoning district. The general location is 9914 Camel's Lot Court in Pearland. We have a staff report.
Thank you, Chair. Let me introduce Patrick Bauer to present the staff case, or staff report. Patrick, take it away.
Thank you, Martin. Good evening, Chair and members of the board. As mentioned, the request before you tonight is actually two requests for the property for a special exception and a landscape buffer variance for an existing machining and fabrication use on the property. As mentioned, the general location is 9914 Camelot's Court, which is the southeast corner of Miller Ranch Road and Camelot's Court, and the zoning is the Suburban Residential 12 zoning district. And a little more information on the two requests. We'll kind of go through them separately throughout the actual PowerPoint, but request one is for the special exception, and that's for the expansion of a pre-existing non-conforming use on the property. And then the landscape buffer variance is to allow for portions of some of the existing buildings and the proposed building expansion to encroach into the required 30-foot landscape buffer along the east and south property line. And additionally, there's also an additional request as a part of the variance to allow for a deviation from the required landscaping within that buffer. So at the time of staff report, staff had received one phone call asking for more information about the request. And looking at as mentioned, the zoning of the property is the Suburban Residential 12 zoning district. That same zoning is to your north and also to the east, with some single-family residential 1 zoning to the south, and then single-family residential 3 to the west, which is more of your denser single-family. And looking at the future land use designation for the property as well as the surrounding properties, we see that the property as well as everything around it is the medium density residential zoning district. And so looking at an aerial view of the property as well as some of the surrounding land uses, we see it's predominantly single family residential with some somewhat larger lots to the north and east, and that more denser to the west. And then there's actually a church to the south. So going through a little bit of history of the property, the image will kind of show you what has been added to the property over time. But the property was originally platted in 1982, and then it was annexed in 1998. Originally it was developed first with a mobile home in 1980, and that mobile home ended up being taken off the site in between 2012 to 2014. And then kind of the first portion of the actual existing use that's on the property today was developed in 1994, with that yellow portion that was developed kind of along Miller Ranch Road, and that's a warehouse and storage building for the use. Then in 1999, the green portion that's next to it was then developed, and it was kind of that same use, just expanding the use. And then next in 2011, there were 2 expansions to the property. First, there was a covered area, which is kind of that magenta color. And then on the east side of the property, there was actually an expansion of the building that was unpermitted. That is that light blue portion of the building. And then more recently, or actually before I get there, in between 2012 and 2014, also the gravel parking area was constructed kind of at the front of the property with access to Camelot's Court and Miller Ranch Road. And then more recently in 2022, there was a covered area that was added with the maroon area that was did not receive a permit, as well as the orange area. That's kind of a smaller 100 square foot expansion on the east side that also was unpermitted. So here we get a view of the,
Patrick, would you pause for a minute?
Yeah.
It appears as though there was a glitch with the recording system in the audio. So it was at the very beginning of the portion. So
It was just a.
but did you hear the motion to approve? And
No, so whenever they raise
okay. No, sir, I don't believe that we need to redo it for the sake of complying with the Open Meetings Act and the recording requirements, at least not all the stuff that was at the very beginning of the meeting. The minutes are going to reflect that. But for the sake of the public, I do think that the beginning of this presentation, we need to go back for the first two slides, the very first slides on this presentation. Not because of complying with the Open Meetings Act, but because of the benefit to the public and because we are broadcasting it. I think everybody has that right to see those things. So if we could just ask Patrick to rewind.
yeah, which slides? Or do you just want me to rewind to the beginning and start over?
They said the very,
Okay. Sorry not to sound like a broken record, but we'll just rewind it there. So the request tonight is for a special exception and a variance for the landscape buffer for an existing machining and fabrication use. The general location is at the southeast corner of Miller Ranch Road and Camelot's Court. And as mentioned previously, the request will be broken up into two sections. The special exception, which is for the expansion of a pre-existing non-conforming use on the property. And then there will be request 2, which is for the landscape buffer variance, which is to allow for portions of the existing buildings and the proposed building expansion to encroach into the required 30-foot landscape buffer along the east and south property line. And additionally, there is an additional request to allow for a deviation from the required landscaping within that buffer. To date, staff has received one phone call asking for more information about the request. And so the zoning of the property, as mentioned, is the Suburban Residential 12 zoning district, and the properties to the north and the east are that same zoning district. And then the property to the south is the Single Family Residential 1 zoning, and the property to the west across Miller Ranch Road is the Single Family Residential 3 zoning district. And the property, as well as all the surrounding properties, are the same future land use designation of medium density residential. And kind of looking at an aerial view and the land uses of the property, we see some single family, kind of medium sized lot to the north and the east, with some more dense, smaller size single family to the west and a church to the south. And going through the history of the property one more time. The property was originally platted in 1982. It was annexed into the city in 1998. It was first then developed with a mobile home in 1980, which was demolished between 2012 to 2014. And then kind of going through the expansions on the property, the first building on the property was in 1994 for the warehouse / storage building, and that's in the yellow on the image. And then the next expansion was in 1999, and that was to expand the use, and that is highlighted in the green area. And then in 2011, there were actually two expansions that were made of the property. There was a covered area, which is shown in the magenta to that original yellow area. And then also there was a blue area that was an expansion onto the warehouse / storage building that was not permitted. And then in between 2012 and 2014, there was a gravel parking area that was constructed, which gave access off of Camelot's Court and Miller Ranch Road. And then more recently in 2022, there was a covered area that was added to the property, which is that maroon area, which is also not permitted. And then there was a 100 square foot expansion in 2022 that was also not permitted. So here we get a look at the street view of the property. We get a look at on the left-hand side is if you're looking from Camelot's Court towards the building. And then on your right-hand side is if you're standing at Miller Ranch Road, this would be looking at that portion of the building as well. So here we get a look at the proposed site plan. The black will be kind of pointing out some of the things on the site, and just to say that the yellow and blue areas are the existing structures on the property. The yellow represents those existing structures that have been there, and the blue represents specifically those existing structures that were not permitted. And then additionally, kind of pointing out where the existing parking is on the property. And then if you can see underneath one of the blue boxes, there is a kind of a red outlined area where I'm pointing at kind of more in towards the front of the building facing Camelot's Court. And this is where that proposed expansion is going. And specifically the expansion is proposed so that they can provide an enclosed area where dry goods can be placed. And so also any outdoor storage can be placed within that building, so it's not visible from any public street or adjacent properties. And so going over the special exception first before we get to the variance, the special exception is specifically for the pre-existing non-conforming use. And this is talking about that existing machining and fabrication use, which existed on the property since 1994, which is prior to the property being annexed into the city in 1998. And essentially that machining and fabrication use, which is classified as a light manufacturing process, is not a permitted use in the SR 12 district. However, the use has existed prior to coming into the city. Therefore, it would be considered a pre-existing non-conforming use and require a special exception for any expansion or further development on the property. And so looking at the criteria for approval of a special exception, criterion 6 actually points specifically to this, and it allows for the city to issue a building permit for the expansion of a pre-existing non-conforming use on a property that is not in compliance with the future land use plan map, granted that there's not any adverse impact from water, wastewater drainage, and street transportation systems, and that is in accord with all city codes and applicable comprehensive plan policies, including those pertaining specifically to land use compatibility. And so staff found that this request met this criterion specifically, and specifically with some additional conditions from staff, which we will go over in the next couple slides. So as mentioned, the site was originally developed with the existing use prior to being annexed into the city. Thus, the use is classified as being pre-existing non-conforming. And in terms of that criterion 6, one of the aspects that we specifically reviewed is if there would be an adverse impact to any of the water, wastewater, drainage, or street transportation systems, as well as being compatible with those surrounding uses. So staff reviewed kind of the site plan as well as the surrounding properties and identified that the existing conditions of the gravel parking area may adversely impact the drainage on site, and that the existing screening within the buffers may not be adequate to screen the use from adjacent properties. Therefore, a recommendation pertaining to the improvement of the parking area has been added to staff's recommendation to address any drainage concerns. And the applicant will need to meet the required landscaping for a non-residential use that is adjacent to a residential use. So even if the existing, if there is existing vegetation within those buffers, either it currently meets it, or if it's inadequate, it'll need to be brought up to code so that it provides a buffer for those adjacent properties. And so additionally, 2 recommendations pertaining to dumpster screening and outdoor storage have been added to staff's recommendation as well. So therefore, staff recommends approval of the special exception request to allow for a building permit to be issued for the expansion of a pre-existing non-conforming use with the following conditions. Condition 1 is the existing parking area on site shall be paved with concrete or asphalt and shall meet the parking lot dimension requirements. Number 2, the on-site dumpster shall be screened with a 6-foot to 8-foot masonry wall with metal gates. And condition 3 is that there shall be no outdoor storage on the site. And so moving to the variant or the landscape buffer variance for the site. On the image, we see the site plan here, and kind of pointing out here, the yellow lines represent where that 30-foot landscape buffer would be located on the site. And the reason the 30-foot landscape buffer is required is because we have a residential use to the east of the property, and then we have a residential zoning to the south. So although it's a church to the south, which a church is a non-residential use, it has a residential zoning, so that buffer would still be required. And so if you're looking on the image, there is kind of that blue outlined area, the light blue, there's an orange and a maroon. And the blue and the orange represent portion of those existing buildings that are within the 30-foot landscape buffer right now. And then the maroon represents the portion of the actual proposed building that is to be enclosed that will be within the buffer. So kind of breaking it up in between what's those existing expansions and what's they're actually proposing. And so looking a little closer at how far they're actually encroaching and what the actual buffer depth would be based on the existing buildings, we'll kind of go piece by piece based on the different expansions. So that light blue area, which was originally built in 2011, it actually encroaches both the buffer along the south and the east. And so along the south side of the property, it encroaches 23 feet into that buffer, which leaves a 7-foot landscape buffer, and that would be what the requested landscape buffer would be for the property. And then on the east side, it encroaches 17 feet into that buffer, which would result in the applicant requesting a 13-foot landscape buffer. And then moving to the orange, smaller area, that's that 100 square foot expansion that occurred in 2022 that was unpermitted. And this one only goes into the eastern buffer, and it encroaches that same 17 feet into the buffer, which would leave a 13-foot landscape buffer afterwards. And then finally, there's that maroon portion, this is the proposed expansion. And the proposed kind of does that same, it encroaches 17 feet into the buffer, and then it would result in the applicant requesting a 13-foot landscape buffer, which would be provided. So along the eastern side, they're all kind of remaining consistent with, they're all encroaching 17 feet in. It's essentially just, it would be like a flat-faced wall. There wouldn't be one area that's coming out a little more than others. But along the, kind of to conclude, along the southern property boundary, that's where they're requesting a 7-foot landscape buffer, and for the buildings to encroach 23 feet into the south buffer. And then along the east, they are requesting a 13-foot landscape buffer with it encroaching 17 feet into that buffer. And kind of going over that additional request that kind of had to do with the deviation from the landscaping requirements. The green area would be where that landscaping would be placed if the board were to approve the variances. And so kind of first going over what the UDC requires. The UDC requirement states that when you have a 30-foot landscape buffer, there's 3 different aspects that are required. The first one is that you provide a continuous vegetative screen for the length of that buffer. And then it also requires that large shade trees be provided for 1 inch per every 10 feet of length. And then that ornamental trees be provided at 1 inch for every 15 feet of length. And so further on in the request, or further on in the slides, we'll kind of delve deeper into what those would come out to for the requirement based on what the lot lengths are. But based on the applicant's request, they are looking to deviate from essentially the continuous shrubs and the large shade tree and ornamental trees by providing a 6-foot tall wood fence for the length of the buffer. And they would provide 4 to 5 trees within that buffer. And then they would also provide kind of rose shrubbery plants within that buffer as well. And that's kind of the 3 aspects that the applicant's requesting to deviate from. And they'll be providing this in lieu of what the landscape buffer normally requires. And so we're reviewing the requested variances based on the criteria for approval. Staff found that the request met 3 of the 8 criteria for granting a variance. And the hardship stated by the applicant does not pertain to a physical feature of the property that is unique to the site, as other properties in the area have been required to meet the landscape buffer. And so therefore, staff is unable to recommend approval of the requested variances based on the approval criteria. However, staff recognizes that it should be noted that the requested variances pertain not only to a new building expansion, but also to existing building expansions, which, while not permitted, would require any portion of those buildings within the landscape buffers to be demolished if the variance is not granted. So if the blue portion, that light blue portion and the orange portion, if variances weren't granted here tonight, then those would be required to be demolished on the site. Thus, staff recommends that the board review the requested variances separately as they pertain to existing and proposed improvements. My bad. And should the board decide to grant any of the requested variances, then the board may need to consider if additional screening materials such as landscaping or fencing or different types of those, of combination of those, are needed to ensure the adjacent properties are adequately screened from the non-residential use. And kind of reviewing what the UDC actually requires for the landscaping, kind of reading through the lines, what I just talked about was the normal buffer requires that a vegetative screen consisting of evergreen shrub be provided that's at least 8 feet tall at the time of full plant or full maturity at 12 months, and it'd be continuous along that buffer, and that the large shade trees be provided at 1 inch for each 10 feet of lot length or depth, and that the ornamental trees be provided at 1 inch for each 15 feet of lot depth. And so kind of taking into consideration that with what the applicant requested, the following calculations have been provided based on what those lot lengths are for the south and east property line. And so looking at the south property line, that property line is approximately 110 feet in length, which if we do the math, it would come out to 11 inches of shade trees and 7 inches of ornamental trees. And that could be met in a number of different ways, but let's just say if we did 2-inch trees, which is the minimum, the calculation would come out to 5.5 trees, which rounded up to 6 because you can't really have half a tree. So roughly they would need 6 shade trees along the south property line to meet the requirement. And then in terms of ornamental trees, it comes out to 3.5 2-inch trees, which rounded up would be 4 trees, or 4 2-inch trees. So roughly along the southern property line, they would need approximately 10 trees to meet for shade and ornamental trees. And then along the east property line, it's approximately 130 feet in length. I think it's a little bit above that, but the shade trees would be required to be 13 inches, which comes out to roughly 6.5 2-inch trees. We can round it up to 7, and then 9 inches of ornamental trees, which comes out to rounded up 5 2-inch trees. So roughly you would need about 12 trees with the shade and ornamental along the east. So looking at that, their proposal was to do 4 to 5 trees, and if those are kind of larger trees, they could meet that inch requirement. But looking at the inches, and if you did kind of smaller trees, it would be required to have 10 along the south and 12 along the east if you did 2-inch trees each. But you could always upgrade those to higher inches and kind of meet that requirement still. And so with the previous considerations in mind regarding the landscaping and what's existing on the site and what's proposed, staff recommends the following: that the board approve the previously existing non-permitted expansions of the building within the 30-foot landscape buffer, and that the board approve the requested building addition to be 17 feet into the required 30-foot landscape buffer for a depth not to exceed 10 feet in length for the building. And also that the board uphold the UDC standard for planting and screening requirements within the required landscape buffer for non-residential uses adjacent to residential uses. And that concludes staff's report.
Thank you so much. Do we have an applicant presentation? Okay. Do we have any persons wishing to speak for or against? Okay, we'd like to move into staff, commission, and applicant discussion. Any questions or comments from the board to the staff or to the applicant?
I want to ask a question of staff. Leave the one slide more, if you would, for us. One, right, whoop. Let's go back to the one you were on. Well, there's one of them on the variants that shows the hand-drawn map where you've got the, right there. Notice I'm looking at the yellow dashed lines. And tell me again what the yellow dashed lines represent, Patrick.
Yeah, so sorry, close to the mic there. So the yellow dashed lines that are, and there's two separate ones here. So in that original, this is where that 30-foot landscape buffer is. And then this next slide, we add the new, should delineate them a little better, but the 30-foot buffer would be the one that's kind of farther away from that south and east property line. And then the closer one shows this is what the new buffer is being requested as to be, instead of 30 being 7 along the south and 13 along the east.
And the reason I asked that question, it looks like the yellow dashed line on the right-hand side. And I think that's the one the applicant's requesting, right?
Yeah. Yes.
That's covering up part of their parking lot, isn't it? Their existing parking lot? It looks like the black dashed lines, I assume that's the driveway. Aren't they kind of,
Yeah, based on the drawing, the existing parking may be going partially into it.
so isn't that where they would have to plant some trees if we're, or some kind of landscape buffer if we're going to approve any of this? They would,
Yes, along the whole buffer, they would be required.
yeah, so they'd lose some width of their driveway there, right?
Potentially, yes. If it's existing, it would be existing on the site. But if they came in to do improvements to it, it could be something that takes into consideration here. If the applicant knows they need a little more, they can make that request to you that it be allowed to go into there. But they may do that in the future if they wanted to expand it out or if it needs to be expanded out further into that 13-foot.
Okay, I'm just curious. That didn't conform or didn't compute. They've got their hand-drawn map of a driveway, and it looks like we're cutting off part of their driveway that they're agreeing to or applying for approval for anyway.
And it may also be important to note that oftentimes hand-drawn drawings may not necessarily be exactly to scale, and whereas staff tries to do a good job of providing at scale. So it could be that the gravel portion of the lot is outside of that 13-foot buffer. We just don't have a survey to say that it is specifically there.
Does, and I'll address this to Patrick again, when staff makes recommendations like this to slight changes to what the applicant has applied for, staff, let's say, recommends approval of the special exception use with the following conditions, and you list some conditions there. You also have recommendations for conditions to the variances. Do y'all present this, or has applicant seen both of those recommendations or sets of recommendations before they come to us for the meeting? Or I'm wondering if applicant responded or had any kind of response to you guys about your recommendations for approval or possible approval.
They do receive the staff report beforehand, and because I've been working with the applicant, the conditions added to the special exception is things that had been discussed previously with the applicant about kind of the surface of the parking and kind of outdoor storage on the lot. So those things had been discussed. I hadn't received any comments back from when the staff report was submitted to then or to now.
That makes it easy for me.
Member Shrum, you could always ask the applicant if they have problems or concerns with the proposed conditions.
But we don't have anybody here that's representing the applicant. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. I heard.
He didn't have a presentation. I think they're here to see what happens and to also answer questions if you have them. So if you want to ask the question, and if they do ask, make sure you go to the microphone in the back so that we could be sure to capture it.
All right. see. Yeah, I see.
You have any other questions or comments from the board?
Well, I'm going to ask, as I do sometimes of Lawrence, of our legal staff anyway. I made this comment to Martin earlier this evening. I was reading through this, and I thought, wait, does the city have any kind of penalties that we could enforce on the contractors who go in and do construction on sites and they don't get the proper permits on things they're required to get permits on, and they just leave the owners hanging, or they get their money in rain and they're home free?
It wouldn't be against the contractor. Normally, it would be against the property owner, who would then have to talk to the contractor, because the property owner is the one who engaged them and told them what to do.
Okay.
So-
I just wondered, we had one last week that was, or last month, when it looked like, well, I'm just wondering, it just doesn't seem fair sometimes. We see contractors go in, I think specifically of an elderly couple 2 or 3 years ago in their backyard.
And
it,
Member Sherm,
to me, took advantage of the property owners.
if I can jump in here real quick with some site history. Some of these building expansions took place prior to the current owner owning it. So part of this variance can be seen as kind of a retroactive approval in order to get the building completely squared away. So I wouldn't necessarily dive too deeply into pointing fingers of who done what and pointing blame, especially for the pieces that are pre-existing. That's not staff's desire or opinion to really hold this property owner accountable for what he bought into.
I know we're not voting on that. That's not before the board tonight, but it just, we see these kinds of circumstances sometimes, and I wonder if the city have any recourse against the people who, we think be the experts about these kind of things. Apparently we don't, but by the by, that's okay.
Martin, I have a question regarding the current owner. Does the current owner do the exact same manufacturing process as the previous one?
Right. So I believe we had a slide that said that the use has been maintained and that it was a machine shop before and it is a machine shop currently. So that's why the use that was initiated when it was in the ETJ is allowed to continue.
Okay. I always was under the impression, and correct me if I'm wrong, if the land changes name, the use doesn't always stay with the land. And when I was on P&Z, that was the understanding we were taught. So I don't know if that's changed since we've gone to the UDC, or so enlighten me. So
Yeah, no. So whenever property gets annexed into the city, if it is, let's just use this example. So it's a machine shop. It's out in the county. The city eventually grows and annexes that property, taking a lot of complexities out of this equation. But as long as a machine shop is still there and it changes ownership from Todd to Martin. Martin now runs the machine shop. As long as that use is still maintained and it never becomes abandoned, then that use is allowed to continue.
okay, that makes sense.
As far as we know, it was a machine shop before. It is currently a machine shop. It will still be a machine shop, which is the reason why this is allowed for a special exception.
All right, my next question, and thank you for that enlightenment. Next question is, we've encroached 3 feet from my math onto the easement on the south side, and we haven't discussed that. And that's, our previous meeting was all about 3 feet into an easement. So how does that play into all of this? Because the way I'm reading that entire building, the back end of the majority of the building is in our easement. We were worried about an overhang last meeting. This one, we got a building in the easement. So,
Right. So again, since the building is within that utility easement, it shows on the site plan. That building prior existed when it was in the county. Then when it became a part of the city inherited that. A prior owner built into and extended the building. And at this time, we're not looking to, the request does not make the extension into the easement any worse. All of the extension is happening in front of the building, away from the utility easement. So for staff's consideration right now, the utility easement isn't in additional harm.
okay. And
Now, of course, if a utility provider comes in there and is necessary, we'll cross that bridge with the property owner when that happens. But right now, it's not, the request isn't making it worse.
At the purchase time that I made in 2012, I'm Don Jordan, we did get permission to encroach from Centerpoint. As based for the property to be changing hands. So it did, there is a permission to encroach with a drawing and a survey done. So
all right, thank you.
that does exist.
Thank you, sir. Would you state your name again and your address for us?
Donald Jordan, 1724 County Road 152, Alvin, Texas, 77511.
Thank you.
And for additional clarification, he is the property owner.
Thank you. Yes, Gary.
Mr. Jordan, I apologize. I assumed when Mark Ascos or anyone applicant presentation, I assumed no one was here for the applicant. My apologies.
It's okay.
No disrespect.
We're here.
That's okay. I'm going to ask the same question I asked Patrick a while ago, if I could of you. The city staff has proposed some changes to the amount of the landscaping measurements and the type and number of landscaping items or methods that might be used. Did you have a reaction or I don't want to say rebuttal, or a reason we would consider your proposed variances with regard to landscaping versus the city's proposed changes to the variance requirements?
Well, Tree and I both have agreed that we're going to cooperate to the best of our abilities, and if we're unable to obtain that, we would reach back out and try to make an appeal. But right now, we think we can make the fencing requirement and the shrubbery and those sort of things. And to your question about the drive, if that got too close within that boundary, there is space, and staff, if you could help me, we could move that, because we do plan in the future, very near future, to be a concrete slab driveway and to get approval for that. And we've already got a mitigation plan for that, or it got quoted for the mitigation for that, and the quote for the concrete drive. So it could easily just be shifted to the left of the image there, away from that boundary that you were referring to. I mean, the culvert would have to go over a little bit, but that would be the only requirement if we did it that way.
Okay. One of the requirements, or one of the suggestions the staff has, is that to approve this, they've suggested or asked that we vote on this with considering a requirement that the parking area be paved with concrete or asphalt and meet the parking lot dimension requirements. And that would be at least the recommendation of staff. And so if we approved it with those recommendations included, it wouldn't be a question of doing it in the future anytime. I mean, that would be part of the requirement if we approved that.
Yeah, so, and whatever the timeline would be, we would,
Okay.
do our best to meet that requirement.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments from the board?
I'd just like to remind the board, staff's recommendation is that we actually take a three-step process on this particular issue. First, in regards to the special exception with proposed staff, how many staff recommendations? I thought I saw three in the presentation.
Right.
So 3 proposed staff recommendations or conditions for the special exception. Then do a separate vote for the existing buildings regarding the variance with staff recommendations. Oh, there it is on the screen, thank you. And then finally, a third vote in regards to the variance for, I forgot how we phrased that, for the landscaping variance
It
requirement?
depends on if you want to break it up into the variance into existing versus proposed, or you can break it down into 3. It's whatever the board feels comfortable. But here's if you broke it down into the existing, and then, or actually it first says proposed, then the existing buildings, then the landscaping. The board can decide to do it this way. This is a way to kind of separate things. But I'll leave it up to y'all to how you want to break them up, or if you even want to break them up. It's up to y'all in the end.
Of course, the easiest, if y'all were comfortable with it, would be to approve the variance request with the staff proposed special exception and variance request with the staff proposed conditions. And that would include all of an all-encompassing issue. But understanding that there might not be support for that, we wanted to give you that option.
Right. I have a couple of questions. So when we mentioned about the driveway and that the driveway needs to be repaired, or if it is repaired, that it will not impact the water, or are we saying that, or what are we saying, that it needs to be repaired because it is impacting?
So because it is a gravel driveway, gravel has the ability to impact
Gotcha.
stormwater. And in order to remove that impact, it's proposed to change to
Gotcha.
concrete or asphalt.
Gotcha. Thank you for the clarification. I appreciate that. Any other questions or comments from the board? Okay, we're going to move into consideration and possible action. I would like to vote separately on the 3 issues that we have on the table. Is that okay with the board? If we could, if you read the first, and if just go with it.
I'll try, but I'm still confused on all of this as well. So it's kind of, so I'll make a motion. We approve the variance 24-04 as presented. Is that correct?
Read that.
Okay. Okay, we want to do it separate. Sorry. So I want to do the one at the top. Okay. I'll make a motion that the request number 1, special exemption to allow the building permit to be issued for the expansion of the pre-existing non-conforming use.
It's a motion on the floor
Is that with the staff proposed conditions?
with
The staff's recommendations.
the staff's proposed recommendations. Is there a second? It's been motioned and second. Any discussion?
I'm with Todd on this a little bit. Tell me, just real briefly, what slide shows the staff's recommendations for what we're voting on here? Or
So this is the special exception, and that would be the 3 conditions pertaining to the parking area, the dumpster screening, and the no outdoor storage. So that's the 3 conditions.
I see that now on my paperwork. Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Any other discussion? All in favor, raise your hand. All opposed, raise your hand. First request carries 5-0 as an affirmative. We have a second request. Somebody read the motion.
Is this the slide we're going to read that from? Yes.
Yeah, and this is how you want to break it up. If you maybe I don't know if you want to have a discussion about how you want to break it up, but it's in the end up to.
Well, I'm trying to find this in my paperwork here that shows what qualifications you wanted to put on this, and I don't see that. Am I missing it in the paperwork in the packet?
Yeah, it should. I don't know the exact page, but it'd be in staff's recommendation section.
Yeah, I don't
Or
see
there
it.
you go, Mark.
Not for this.
Top of page 5, or
Right.
between page 4 and 5.
Okay, we're gonna let Jerry go ahead and make that motion.
Make a motion to approve variance 24 as presented.
It's a motion on the floor to request variance 24-04, request 2 as presented
With or without staff's conditions.
with staff's conditions. All in favor? Excuse me. Is there a second? Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion?
With the way that it was presented, I assume that to be all of the variants with all of the proposed conditions.
Yes, now it has been presented that way. Yes. Any other discussion? All in favor, raise your hand. All opposed, raise your hand. Motion carries 5-0, and that concludes the meeting for May 2nd, 2024, and it is 6:47 p.m.